What if you could access cutting-edge medical treatments years before FDA approval? Imagine a place where doctors can legally prescribe experimental drugs that have barely begun the testing process. This isn't science fiction or a foreign medical tourism destination. It's happening right now in Montana, where groundbreaking legislation is creating America's first hub for experimental medical treatments. The implications could transform healthcare access, challenge regulatory norms, and potentially reshape how we approach longevity itself. Montana has just passed revolutionary legislation allowing medical clinics to sell treatments not approved by the FDA. This bill, expected to be signed by Governor Greg Gianforte, permits doctors to open experimental treatment clinics where they can recommend and sell therapies that have completed only the most preliminary safety testing. Unlike previous right to try laws designed primarily for terminally ill patients, this legislation dramatically expands access to anyone seeking experimental treatments, particularly those aimed at extending human lifespans. The Montana legislation establishes a revolutionary framework for experimental treatment clinics throughout the state. These facilities will receive legal authorization to sell and administer drugs manufactured within Montana's borders that have completed only Phase I clinical trials. This represents a dramatic departure from standard medical practice, as Phase I trials merely establish basic safety parameters with small groups of typically healthy volunteers, usually fewer than 50 participants. These preliminary studies aren't designed to determine effectiveness, only to identify immediate safety concerns. Traditional FDA approval requires drugs to progress through multiple increasingly rigorous testing phases over many years. Phase I trials assess effectiveness with hundreds of participants, while Phase IIs involve thousands of volunteers to confirm safety and efficacy before market approval. This comprehensive process typically takes 10 to 15 years to complete. Montana's approach effectively bypasses most of this regulatory pathway, thus requiring only the most rudimentary safety screening before making experimental treatments available to the public. The legislation includes several key provisions beyond simplified access. Physicians prescribing these experimental treatments receive protection from disciplinary action by medical boards. The bill also establishes enhanced informed consent requirements, mandating that patients receive comprehensive information about potential outcomes and FDA-approved alternatives. Clinics must secure licenses, renewed annually, to operate under this framework. These regulations create a structured system where experimental treatments can be legally administered outside traditional regulatory oversight. What makes this legislation particularly significant is its application to all Montana residents, not merely those with terminal illnesses. Previous right to try laws limited experimental treatment access to patients with life-threatening conditions. Montana's expanded approach opens these treatments to anyone interested in trying unproven therapies, creating unprecedented access to experimental medicine within American borders. This groundbreaking legislation wasn't conceived within traditional medical or pharmaceutical circles. Instead, it was developed and championed by a coalition of longevity enthusiasts, a diverse group including scientists, libertarian activists, and influential figures focused on extending human lifespans. Organizations like the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives actively lobbied for the bill, with founder Dylan Livingston directly involved in its development alongside Montana State Senator Kenneth Bogner. The longevity community has identified FDA regulations as a significant obstacle to developing treatments that might slow or reverse human aging. With no drugs currently approved specifically to treat aging processes, they view Montana's approach as potentially revolutionary. By creating a domestic alternative to overseas destinations where wealthy Americans travel for experimental anti-aging treatments, these advocates envision Montana becoming a Los Alamos for longevity, a reference to the famous scientific research facility where breakthrough technologies emerged. Key figures in this movement include Todd White, who left his telecommunications career to work with blockchain-based longevity research funding, and tech entrepreneur Nicholas Anzinger, who previously founded longevity-focused communities in Honduras. These advocates collaborated directly on drafting the Montana legislation, viewing it as potentially transformative for accessing treatments that might extend healthy lifespans. Some even hope the model will spread to other states, creating a network of experimental treatment hubs throughout America. The timing aligns with broader libertarian movements advocating for greater medical autonomy and reduced government regulation. The bill's supporters frame access to experimental treatments as a fundamental right, a matter of personal freedom rather than a public health concern. This perspective represents a significant philosophical challenge to decades of established medical regulatory practice in America, which has prioritized protection from harm over speed of access. Advocates highlight numerous potential advantages of Montana's experimental treatment legislation. First and foremost, it dramatically expands individual medical autonomy, empowering people to make personal decisions about their bodies without government intervention. For patients frustrated by the lengthy FDA approval timeline, especially those interested in anti-aging treatments, this provides immediate options that would otherwise require years or decades of waiting. The economic benefits could be substantial. By creating a domestic alternative to international medical tourism, Montana aims to capture a market currently flowing to countries with less restrictive regulations. Wealthy Americans currently travel to places like Honduras and where special economic zones permit access to experimental treatments, including stem cell therapies and gene therapies costing upwards of $20,000. Montana's approach could keep these healthcare dollars within American borders, potentially generating significant tax revenue and creating specialized medical jobs. Supporters also argue this approach might accelerate medical innovation. By allowing more extensive human testing outside traditional regulatory frameworks, effective treatments could potentially reach broader markets faster. This real-world testing environment might reveal benefits and complications that controlled clinical trials miss. Multiple clinics are reportedly already planning to establish operations in Montana, potentially creating an entirely new industry sector focused on experimental medical treatments. For patients seeking treatments for conditions with limited options, this legislation offers new possibilities. Rather than attempting to access treatments through compassionate use exceptions or traveling internationally, they can receive experimental therapies domestically with greater oversight than currently available in foreign destinations. Proponents suggest this supervised access, with enhanced informed consent requirements, represents a more responsible approach than forcing patients to seek unregulated treatments overseas. Despite enthusiastic support from longevity advocates, many bioethicists and medical experts have expressed serious concerns about Montana's approach. The fundamental issue centers on patient safety. Phase I trials typically involve very small groups and examine only immediate dangers, not long-term risks or effectiveness. Statistical realities highlight these concerns. Approximately 90% of drug candidates fail during clinical trials, with about 17% failing late-stage trials specifically due to safety issues. Even FDA-approved medications sometimes require market withdrawal after rare but serious side effects emerge in larger populations. The legislation also raises profound ethical questions about informed consent. Critics question whether patients can truly make informed decisions about experimental treatments when even the prescribing doctors won't know if these treatments work. What long-term risks might emerge? As bioethicist Allison Bateman-House of New York University noted, if a drug has not been through clinical trials, how do you have any standing on which to think it isn't going to do any harm? The traditional medical system prohibits profit without evidence of both safety and efficacy. This legislation fundamentally alters that equation. Legal complications may also arise. Federal law requires FDA approval for drugs distributed in interstate commerce, limiting these experimental treatments to those both produced and sold within Montana's borders. For previous court cases, including a 2007 ruling against the Abigail Alliance, they have rejected arguments that individuals have a constitutional right to access experimental treatments. This suggests potential future conflicts between state and federal authorities. Equity concerns persist, despite provisions requiring clinics to allocate 2% of annual profits to support access for qualifying Montana residents. Critics worry this approach simply extends potentially ineffective or harmful treatments to more people, rather than ensuring equitable access to proven care. As Bateman House pointedly observed, on the one hand, I like equity. On the other hand, I don't like equity to snake oil. Montana's experimental treatment legislation represents a bold departure from decades of established medical regulatory practice in America. By allowing access to treatments that have undergone only minimal safety testing, the state is positioning itself as an alternative to both traditional FDA pathways and overseas medical tourism destinations. The bill reflects growing tensions between individual medical freedom and collective safety protections, between rapid access to innovation and methodical scientific validation. As clinics prepare to open their doors in Montana, the nation watches what could become either a pioneering model for other states or a cautionary tale about regulatory shortcuts. This story is just beginning to unfold. What do you think about Montana's approach to experimental treatments? Would you consider trying a treatment that's only completed phase I trials? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're interested in the future of medicine, longevity science, and healthcare regulation, hit subscribe and the notification bell to stay updated as this groundbreaking experiment develops. Thanks for watching.